Record to this computer. Okay. All right. Very good. Okay. Thank you all for coming tonight. As you can see on the screen in front of you, um, tonight's class is Challenges in Technology, class number 2 in the series. And tonight we're going to be talking about the use of an elevator on Shabbos. Now, I'm just going to put my phone on silent. Oh, come on. Don't play games with me. The as as a child growing up in Toronto, my parents were members of the Bayit. Now, the Bayit went through several iterations. One of the interesting aspects about the Bayit was that at one point in time, it was in fact just a Bayit. It was just a house. And my parents were members of the Bayit when it was a house show, when it was that small. It eventually got too big for the house, and they built this grand building on Clark Avenue. I think it's Avenue. It might be Street. I'm not sure. It's been a long time since I lived in Toronto. And with the construction of this new building, they installed Shabbos elevators. Now, what exactly is a Shabbos elevator? A Shabbos elevator is an elevator that you do not control. You do not push any buttons, and it automatically stops at every single floor. And as we're going to go through in the class, we're going to see that that's not the only thing. That's not the only modification that's made to the Shabbos elevator. There are other things as well. But here you can see on the screen in front of you, this is a typical kind of placard that they sometimes put in elevators that are Shabbos elevators. It's a Shabbos elevator on the Jewish Sabbath and holiday. This elevator stops automatically at each floor. And if you live in larger Jewish communities where you perhaps have a large number of Jewish residents in an apartment building, multi-story apartment building, you will sometimes find Shabbos elevators in those buildings as well in order to meet the needs of the Jewish the Sabbath observance um, residents. And we're going to talk about all the discussions that go into a Shabbos elevator or elevators in general. We're going to be asking the question, is there a problem getting into an elevator? Let's imagine for a moment you don't live in a world where there's a Shabbos elevator, but but you see that there are other people going up, you see other people going down. Can you just hop in and join the other people there? Perhaps your weight, perhaps your very presence constitutes a problem with regards to the elevator. And this will have a knock-on effect for a Shabbos elevator as well. So let's talk about, for example, the earliest authorities who discuss elevators. We're going to take a look at the earliest responsa. We're going to take a look first at the strict view of the Minchas Yitzchak and the Chalkas Yaakov. This is Dayan Yitzchak Weiss and Rabbi Yaakov Breish, and we're going to discuss their opinions. Both of them were stringent. Both Dayan Weiss and Rav Breish, they forbade using elevators on Shabbos, even if they're set to automatically stop at every floor, like a Shabbos elevator is. And even if you have a non-Jew who you're not instructing to push the buttons, who's pushing the buttons for their own benefit, you're not allowed to get in. You're not allowed to ride the elevator with them. So let's take a look at these opinions first. First, we have Dayan Weiss. What does he say? He says, the rider's additional weight in the elevator cabin causes the elevator to work hard, thereby, let me just admit these people in, thereby causing its motor to draw more current. In essence, according to Dayan Weiss, anytime you're stepping into the elevator, it's almost as though you're flipping on a light switch. You are causing electric equipment to change how it operates, to pull more current and to work harder to raise the person up. And as a result, according to Dayan Weiss, one may not get into an elevator, Shabbos or otherwise. Even if a non-Jew were to push the buttons, you don't ask him to do anything. Your weight affects how the engine operates. It draws more current, and as a result, you have transgressed the Shabbos. So that
Going down as well.
right now we're talking about going up. The assumption is, according to everyone, is that going down is better, but we're going to talk about some of the more contemporary opinions that actually say that it's a little bit more complicated when it comes to going down, and perhaps going down is worse than going up. But right now we're talking about going up. Going up causes the engine to work harder, according to Dayan Weiss. Now, Rav Breish gives a absolutely fascinating explanation as to why it's forbidden to ride in an elevator. And his rationale would apply to it would have many applications we'll talk about shortly. But does everybody here see this picture on the bottom right-hand corner? Does anybody know what that is? You have people carrying a chair, and there's a person sitting in the chair. Do you know what we call that? That's a sedan. That is the original sedan. That's what our cars are named for. It is a fancy chair with poles that people carry. There is a rabbinic prohibition against sitting in a sedan on Shabbos because it's not in keeping with the spirit of Shabbos. While technically the people who are down below who are carrying this honored, dignified gentleman are perhaps doing so in an Eruv where there is no problem with carrying, it's just not Shabbostic behavior to start carrying people around unnecessarily. And as a result, there's a rabbinic edict that says one may not sit in a sedan to prevent this situation from playing out on Shabbos. Now, Rav Shmelkus, I know this is your favorite posek, Eugene. Rabbi Yitzchak Shmelkus actually applies this rule to a much more common circumstance. What about getting into a trolley? What about riding a train? Would that perhaps run afoul of this idea of being carried and moved in a horizontal direction? According to Rav Shmelkus, just as one is not allowed to ride in a sedan on Shabbos, so too a person is not allowed to ride on a subway. A person is not allowed to get on a bus. A person cannot ride in all, cannot get involved, cannot ride any of these conveyances because it would be just like sitting in a sedan. And as a result, it is forbidden. So that is what Rav Shmelka says. Now, Dayan Breish applies that rationale and says it makes no difference if you're going in a horizontal direction or if you're going in a vertical direction. Just as being conveyed from point A to point B is forbidden, and as Rav Shmelkes sort of extends it not only to people carrying a person in a chair, but also to mechanical conveyances, so too an elevator would be subject to the very same consideration. So these are the two stringent opinions, and they both say that one may not get into a Shabbos elevator that is going up. Going down is perhaps not, perhaps at least according to Diane Weiss, not a problem. According to Rav Breish, it may be, may not be. We're going to leave that for now. But according to both of these opinions, one may not get into an elevator, even a Shabbos elevator on Shabbos, or alternatively, if you have non-Jews who you know are going to your same destination and they're going to push a button and you can get on with them and get off with them, you're not allowed to ride it because your very presence itself constitutes a problem. Now, these are the two stringent opinions. These are the two lenient opinions. The first is Rav Henkin. Rav Henkin and Rav Unterman, for that matter, both felt that it is permissible to ride in the elevator, provided that the Jew is not the one pushing buttons, and provided that he's not asking the non-Jew to push buttons for them. In general, we say one is not allowed to ask a non-Jew to do things for them, but they're not allowed to do themselves. What is the rationale for this? What is the basis of the opinion? So Rav Henkin writes, Rav Henkin says that the halacha follows the opinion of Beis Hillel. That says that if you set up something to happen before Shabbos, and that is a non-Shabbos approved behavior or activity, but you're not actively engaged with it, it's happening automatically, and it continues even into Shabbos, that does not constitute a desecration of Shabbos. That's the way we're able to rely on timers. Timers operate on the same principle. You set up something before Shabbos and it happens automatically on Shabbos itself. Therefore, he felt that accordingly, if the rider performs no malacha, if a person is doing absolutely nothing, specifically talking about a Shabbos elevator, the use of the elevator on Shabbos would be permitted. He doesn't have a problem with getting into the elevator. Now, Rav Unterman, he actually added, he says, and I'm quoting over here, I have personally witnessed great Torah sages entering an elevator and traveling to the floor for which a non-Jewish passenger pushed the button. They never raised the possibility of their added weight posing a halachic problem. So it seems to be that they are of the opinion that just simply being present and simply having weight maybe it affects the elevator, maybe it doesn't affect the elevator. Even if it does affect the elevator, it does not constitute a desecration of Shabbos. It's not a problem. They have no worries, they have no concern about it. They also seem to be they completely reject Rav Breich's concern. Rav Breich was concerned about the sedan. They all seem to say that, that's specific to a sedan. You can't extrapolate and apply that to other cases. Rav Unterman even tells the story about how he was present one Shabbos, and he's dating himself. Allah Shalom, he's passed away. One Shabbos when the Chofetz Chaim was meeting with some rabbinic figures to discuss some community matters, when the Chofetz Chaim needed something brought to him, one of those present proceeded to ride an elevator with a non-Jewish passenger and was able to retrieve the item. And none of the assembled rabbis, which included the Chofetz Chaim, objected to this ride in the elevator. And it should be noted that it seems that Rav Moshe Feinstein also does not have a concern and doesn't seem to be bothered about the person's mere presence impacting the functioning of the elevator. And as a result, we don't seem to have a problem. And again, we're talking about the ascending part of the elevator.
Counterweight anyways. The motor is actually pulling the elevator down.
You're right. We're going to get into this. That's because this you're working with tubas that are because you start getting into sort of Rav Halpern and the Tzomid Institute, and they start getting involved with modern elevators and there's also a whole other system that creates a problem here. We'll get to that in a moment. So based on the opinions that we've just quoted over here, it appeared that Rav Henkin and Rav Unterman's ruling should be considered the normative halacha. Rav Breich's novel approach, where he compares elevators to trains and trolleys, doesn't seem to have much halachic support. And we don't find that there are any halachic authorities who ever quote this or who cite this and who put this into practice subsequent to his own opinion. And also, the increased current that we're concerned about, the man standing in the elevator, the woman standing in the elevator, generally men are heavier. We're worried that perhaps it's going to cause the electricity the engine to draw more electricity, or the motor to draw more electricity. Perhaps that becomes a problem. Well, the reason why they don't seem to be terribly worried about this is because we consider this to be a grumma. Grumma, if you can think back to the last class that we had, a grumma essentially means where I'm not actively engaging with the whatever it is that's not allowed to be done on Shabbos. I'm setting a course of action that causes perhaps a desecration to be Shabbos. So what would be the example in our case over here? How do we explain this? The individual is stepping into the elevator. The motor is not running at the time. After the person stands in the elevator for a short period of time, the motor kicks in and it starts the motion upwards, let's say. The individual at the time that the motor has kicked in is not acting on the engine. He's not actively engaged with the action. Everything that he did, which was positioning himself, took place beforehand. And as a result, we consider that to be a grumma. And if you can think back to the last class that we gave, that's comparable to the situation where a person opens up a refrigerator door, which causes the cold air to come out, the warm air to come in, and the warm air then triggers the thermostat and causes the condenser to start working. We said that is a knock-on effect where the initial action is perhaps setting up a series of causes and effects that bring about the result, which is the action that might be sort of in violation of Shabbos, but because it's not a direct action affecting the other, it's sort of a knock-on effect. We view that differently. We call that a grumma, and we are much more lenient in many of these situations.
So with that argument, because whether the person enters or not, at some point the elevator is going to close its doors and go up, versus if it was somehow an elevator which was motion detector, or when someone walked in and the weight trigger the doors to close enough, that would be a problem.
Yes,
More of a problem for this argument.
yes, exactly,
But
right.
this thing, if you go in, you don't.
So
go
that's
out,
that's what we're
it's
gonna. I was gonna get eventually to the motion sensors. It's good you're bringing it up. So I mentioned, for example, the Bayit and the Shabbos elevator there, and you might think, well, every time you step into an elevator, isn't there like a little motion detector, some kind of a laser that's going across that detects a person there, and that's how it knows if there's somebody in the door, so that for the door doesn't close on them. Well, Shabbos elevators will often have that function disabled, and there's an auxiliary system that elevators have where it's not a laser, but there's a sliding part of the door itself that when pushed in stops the door from closing. That part of the door will not press against. If the elevator door closes all the way, there's a space there so that part that juts out isn't actually going to be affected. But if there's somebody standing there, and usually runs from the top to the bottom of the door, if a person's standing there and the door closes on them and it detects the person being there through physical force, it's a very analog system. So that was how the Bayit worked around the motion sensor. The door would actually have to start closing, and it would feel the person there for it to stop the door from closing, as opposed to using a light. So therefore, it's not like every time a person gets on, the elevator detects there's somebody here. The door would actually have to physically be closing on somebody in order for the door to know that there was somebody present.
The whole element where they never stop in their continuous motion, you have to hop there and hop off.
It wasn't in continuous motion.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
one side goes up, one side goes
Right.
down, it's continuous.
Uh-huh.
There's a few of them still in the world, they're like an original elevator design.
Uh-huh.
Those would solve the problems of there's no buttons and there's no doors, but those would have the problem of you're getting in while it's moving. So presumably, if that's the loophole, you're
Right. So we'll get because that's probably closer to an escalator, and we're going to say escalators do not because of how they function, do not pose a problem at all. But
would have the same issue. You step on, technically, you're using more current.
yeah, so that's what we're saying here. We're not worried about the additional current that's being used.
Like I said, it's like the elevators specifically don't move they're not moving when you step on. And then when you're not doing anything once you start moving. With an escalator, they are moving once you step on. So that
Well, no,
that's a different mechanism.
but it's constantly in motion. That's also where we're going to say something. If there's actually no physical change, nothing is being modified or altered by your very presence. We'll get to that eventually. We're going to discuss all these ideas.
Some escalators can be problematic.
Anywho, right. Anyways, so, all right. So let's getting back to our discussing over here. Okay. However, this is where things get really complicated. And here is Rav Halpern. Rav Halpern is the director of the Institute for Science and Halacha in Jerusalem. And he published a work on elevators, which he entitled Ma'aliot b'Shabbos, which essentially means elevators on Shabbos. And it revolutionized the way many halachic authorities view elevator usage on Shabbos. Rav Halpern, just to give just a little bit of an introduction from his own introduction, he actually wrote that he had been invested in no less than 16 years into figuring out all the halachic challenges posed by elevator usage on Shabbos. He relates that he traveled numerous times to elevator manufacturers in Europe and the United States to meet with their engineers and discuss how they operate and what perhaps some of the halachic considerations might be. He speaks about having visited the Otis, Westinghouse, and Schindler factories. And his conclusion is that while one may ascend in an automated elevator, one may not get into an elevator that's going down unless certain modifications have been made to avoid specific halachic pitfalls. And Rav Halpern's conclusions are essentially the opposite of what these aforementioned halachic authorities are, where they assumed going down is not a problem at all, but going up perhaps poses a halachic consideration. He actually says that going down poses greater halachic concern. So he insists that riding an ascending elevator is permitted, riding a descending elevator is fraught with halachic problems. So he points out that the weight of the passengers riding in the elevator assists the elevator's motor in the descent of the elevator. And this is what he writes. If the passenger is responsible for the descent, then it's not just the elevator's movement that he becomes responsible for, but he's responsible also for every aspect of how the elevator is operating. Since he's facilitating it, he's assisting it in its downward motion. He's responsible also for its lights, for the for the connections of the door motor, the brakes, and numerous other electric circuits which are activated during the descent. And he points out another problem. He says, no, it's not just that you're assisting the engine and the motor, and therefore you become responsible for every part of the elevator's function. But he also writes, let's see if I included this here. When the car is descending with a heavy passenger load, it may speed up to the point where the counter force developed in the motor is greater than the force of the electric power station, which means that there's more force in the downward motion because of all the people who are present. And sometimes that can even be more powerful than the amount of electricity that's being drawn by the motor that facilitates the downward motion. When this occurs, he writes, the motor, rather than aiding the descent, is used to brake the car, thus preventing a dangerous overspeed. When the speed of a motor increases to a value above that for which it was designed, it automatically becomes a generator. Instead of consuming electrical energy, it generates power, which is then fed back into the electric system, and it's used by other consumers in the immediate vicinity. So if you know anything about sort of how electric generation works, it has to do with magnets and
It's an alternator.
yeah, right, exactly. And so when the engine starts going faster than the amount of energy that is drawing, it starts generating electric currents.
Use that.
That's right.
That's what he said.
So he's saying that there are two issues. One issue is that if you're assisting in its downward movement, then you become responsible for every aspect of how the elevator functions at that point. And he says that you're also generating electric current, which is then being used by other people and other and other electronic appliances, which then you bear responsibility for. And so in an article that was that describes or discusses some of these halachic parameters here, um, a Mr. Y. Kornbluth, who is a New York engineer, who was one of the Society for Science and Halacha, Rabbi Halperin's Institute. He actually cited a study from 1995 um, that when the World Trade Center elevator was working at full capacity going down at around 5 p.m. when everybody was leaving their offices to go home for the day, the lights, and they had incandescent lights at the time inside the elevator and in the buttons of the elevator, they would, as they were going down, because of the additional electricity that's being generated, they would shine more brightly than they did at other times of the day because of the excess electricity that was being produced at the time. The lights would burn brighter than usual. So Reb Halperin was of the opinion that going down poses a greater halachic challenge than going up. So this sets us off on a widespread debate between Rabbi Halperin, who argued that going down is a problem, and Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who says it does not pose a problem at all. If you recall, when we were talking about electricity and electronic appliances in the last class, Reb Shlomo Zalman was the lenient opinion who said that electricity itself does not constitute a problem, and perhaps a rabbinic one at the most, but there's no biblical transgression that's being applied. Electricity and use of electric appliances was one of Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach's passions, and it's his halachic opinions that we rely on in most cases against the Chazon Ish, who was much more stringent. Here we find another argument where Reb Shlomo Zalman argued also for leniency against Reb Halperin's stringency. Again, our helper argued that if you're in the elevator, your weight is assisting the motor in its descent. You therefore bear responsibility for every function of the elevator as it goes down. You're also responsible for increased generation of electricity, while Reb Shlomo Zalman completely disagreed. So let's take a look at their respective opinions. We're going to discuss 4 core areas of dispute. And it's a fascinating discussion, and that's why we're going to be discussing it. So Reb Shlomo Zalman suggests that since the passengers did not cause any change in the pace of the elevator, either faster or slower, for even without the passengers, everything would have occurred exactly the same way. It is considered as though the passengers' actions are irrelevant and halachically insignificant. So Reb Shlomo Zalman is essentially working with an interesting idea as to what does it mean for there to be a transgression of Shabbos. In order for a transgression of Shabbos, you have to be committing one of the 39 categories of malacha or labor. But how do we classify labor? What exactly is the labor that is prohibited on Shabbos? They are constructive, creative acts. You have to be doing something that changes something. The Gemara tells us the following. Let's imagine I have a piece of parchment and I have DO, like, the ink that we use for the Sefer Torah. It's different than our ink, which is absorbed into the paper. We're talking about something a little bit different here. So you'll understand this Gemara, the Gemara's reference. Let's say I have 2 letters written down, on this piece of parchment. And I write with the quill, with wet ink, on top of those letters, the exact same letters. Have I transgressed Shabbos, the Shabbos prohibition of writing? And the Gemara says, no, you have not. And the commentators explain, you might think that, well, with the application of this wet ink, you're actually dissolving the dry ink, and therefore essentially you're erasing it, and you're now writing 2 new letters. This is not what we call a meleches machsheves. This is not a considered work. This is not considered to be a creative act. There's no change. You haven't added anything to what was there before. If through your actions, through your activity, everything remains as it was before you perform that action, then you are guilty of no infraction on Shabbos because you have committed no creative act. So Shlomo Zalman says, thus, simply by you being present on the elevator, since it changes nothing about how the elevator operates, even if it's drawing more current, if it isn't drawing more current, it doesn't matter. The elevator is still acting in the exact same way. You have not altered its function in any manner. We might argue about the lights. You can disregard that as being a very, very unusual situation at a very, very busy, very tall building. Your average apartment building, your average Shabbos elevator does not have a discernible change in how it operates by the virtue of a person or 2, or even several people riding in the elevator. And that's how Rav Shlomo Zalman disagrees with Rav Halperin's point of view, arguing that a descending elevator would be permitted. Now, Rav Halperin actually wrote a rebuttal to this, and he disputes his proofs, and he cites proofs to the contrary. One proof that he cites is the following case. Let's imagine I have 2 candles in front of me. One candle is lit, and the other one is extinguished. And on Shabbos, I extinguish the lit one and light the extinguished one. At the end of the day, I still have one candle lit and another candle blown out. Technically, there's been no change here. Yet, still, the Gemara says in that case you have transgressed the Shabbos, and you can definitely quibble with his point. But that's ultimately what he's trying to highlight here, anyways. That sometimes, even if one has not accomplished anything new, he's considered to have performed a melacha on Shabbos. Moreover, he says, the additional passenger's weight does have a noticeable effect on the elevator in that it increases the velocity of the elevator.
And sorry, at the time he concluded that, was that proven like through the elevator? Like,
yeah, he did. Right, but I think Rav Shlomo Zalman would argue it's so imperceptible.
designed to not have elevated constant speed, so the system is fighting that, but so it's within the noise of the
Yeah.
system's ability to.
It's not
Right.
like you went from 30 seconds down to like 2 seconds, right?
No, not like that.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
Exactly. Well, because I mean, an elevator, if it goes too fast and then stops too
Well,
short,
there's other.
right? It's unsafe. But he says that it's enough, and that's probably sort of where they're quibbling. Is that change in velocity enough to be considered a perceivable change or difference? All right, so that's argument number one. Argument number two. So Rabbi Halperin also seeks to demonstrate that one is halachically responsible for the effects of his weight, even if he is standing still. And he uses a proof here. You can see over here, this is a Mishnah. This is a Mishnah from Kilayim. This is talking about taking a horse and taking an ox and having them both yoked up together to pull a plow. The Torah says you can't mix the species. However you want to explain what the rationale is, we call that Kilayim. That's a forbidden mixture. You don't do things like that. So it says here, if a person leads two animals that are yoked up together, that person is liable for kilayim. But not only that, let's imagine a case where you have a person sitting in a wagon, and at the back of the wagon is attached a plow, and in front of the wagon are these two animals. And a person climbs up into the wagon and sits down, and the animals there feel or sense the person's presence, and they say, okay, there's somebody sitting in the wagon, time for us to go forward, and they begin to walk forward. The person is liable for lashes. He's considered to have transgressed. And Rabbi Halperin says from this we can prove that even if one is sitting absolutely motionless in the wagon, and it's merely his weight that causes the animals to move forward and to pull the plow, he's still halachically responsible for the result. So similarly, even though the rider in an elevator is motionless and it's only his weight that causes the elevator to descend, the person is still responsible for the actions of his weight. That is Halperin's proof that says that, yeah, by simply just being there, your weight itself can bear responsibility. There are obviously several responses to this. If you take a look at that Mishnah again, it could be exactly as I explained it. They feel you sitting down. It's not simply that you're there that causes them to pull the plow. It's they feel you getting on and sitting down. That's more akin to flipping a switch as opposed to just standing still and just existing. So as a result, probably this is not a good proof text, according to those who disagree with Rabbi Halperin. And furthermore, we are aware of many halachic authorities who, does that, like, let's imagine, just take a step back. You're on a transatlantic trip and you're in the days before airplanes. So you're on a steam-powered ship that's taking you from Europe to North America. How long is that going to take? It's going to take a long time. It could take let's say it'll take a week. You're definitely going to be there on Shabbos. If your weight is, well, if we're going to say that your weight is a factor and you're responsible for the increased fuel consumption of a conveyance by simply you being present on that conveyance, that would mean you're not allowed to ever get on that ship that takes you across the Atlantic Ocean because you are transgressing the Shabbos. But that's obviously a ridiculous argument, and there's not a single authority who says you're not allowed to sit on a ship that's taking you across the Atlantic on Shabbos. Simply being present does not bear responsibility. You have to actually do something. Yeah, like getting on the boat. That perhaps now there's more weight than it was before. But if you were there before the engine starts turning on, you're not responsible for the increased fuel cost. And that's how people disagree with the whole concept of the elevator now drawing more current, perhaps creating greater liability. And we have many, many proof of great rabbis crossing the Atlantic and not being particularly worried about the increase in fuel consumption, even if it's minuscule compared to a large ship with a great number of passengers. Maybe you can start quibble with numbers, like how much is drawn, I guess, as you know, how many watts is now being utilized per person, one being greater than the other. Um, but I'll give you another example of where we do not seem to be worried about this. Ramosha Feinstein talks about a woman in labor in one of his responsa. Let's say the woman goes into labor on Shabbos and you call the ambulance to take the woman to the hospital. Is the husband allowed to get in the ambulance and sit with his wife? And the answer Moshe Feinstein says is no problem, no issue. He's
Stay married.
yeah.
That's not why he said it.
But anyways, he says you might get on it because you want to stay married, but you do not have to worry about the desecration of the Shabbos, even if it's going to now have to draw more gasoline or whatever, or diesel, or however whatever the fuel is.
Is that because it's going to anyways take her?
Well, essentially, what we're trying to argue is that a person's weight itself, just simply being there, and because of you being there, more electricity or fuel is being drawn, does not constitute a desecration of Shabbos. What's that?
Sedan?
Yeah, but probably that's yeah. Well, again, everybody rejects Rabbi Breish's halachic opinion when it comes to this. I don't know anyone who says because we're worried about the sedan issue. Anywho's, and there's another consideration also, and that is that when a person gets on the elevator, the increase in fuel consumption or energy, the increase in, or the, I guess the increase in velocity, it's beyond a person's intention. That's not his intent. He's not concerned about it, and he's not even aware of it. There is a Maggid Mishnah, who was one of the commentators to the Rambam, who argues and says that in order for a desecration of Shabbos to be present, all three of those components must be present. Let me give you an example. Let's say I'm a very poor man, and I'm only able to afford rent in a tiny little room. And it's the middle of the winter, and I light Shabbos candles, or my wife lights Shabbos candles. And I'm sitting in this room, the door is closed and the windows are closed. I'm breathing in oxygen and exhaling carbon dioxide in a small little room where I'm not breathing directly on the candles. You can make the argument that the decrease in oxygen and the increase in carbon dioxide is going to affect the light, even if just in a minuscule sort of way. But that obviously is not a problem. That's not an issue. Again, because exhaling and inhaling, just going through your daily routine, just breathing, um, uh, does not. When you do this, you have no intention to diminish the light of the candles. You're not particularly concerned. It's not enough for you to be worried about the change in the oxygen levels, and you're probably not even aware of it at all. It's imperceptible, and it's not something that you're particularly cognizant of. As a result, there's obviously no problem in that case. There's no transgression of the Shabbos. Likewise, those who disagree with Reb Halperin would argue and say that there is no prohibition here, there's no worry, there's no concern. You simply being present does not raise an issue. Now, again, you can quibble and you can respond to many of these concerns here. Just like you can quibble and respond to the interpretation of this Mishnah, you can also argue that, well, perhaps Chazal are not going to, we're dealing with rabbinic edicts over here. They're not going to tell you you're not allowed to breathe, but they can still probably tell you probably shouldn't get onto an elevator if you don't need to be on the elevator. That you could probably say that there's perhaps some kind of a difference, and we view these situations as markedly different. But the fact remains, though, that I think that the most compelling argument is the argument that that comes from Moshe Feinstein. People getting on in ambulances, even the healthy people, to accompany those who are in need of the conveyance. We're not worried about the additional fuel consumption. That does not constitute a transgression of Shabbos. It's not of concern. All right, now this is where things we can get lost in the weeds here. So we're going to try and make this very, very short. But there is an idea. And over here, as you can see, you have two movers carrying a couch. Now, obviously, one seems to be doing a less effective job than the other, right? The person in the foreground is not really picking it up, and the other one has it nice and high. Let's imagine that you have two parties who are engaged in some kind of a, Shabbos prohibited behavior. They're doing something together, and each one of them independently could effectively do the act. So let's imagine for a moment, this is something that comes up on occasion. Let's say that there's a light in the refrigerator that will turn on if you open the door. If let's imagine that you then get your friend, neighbor, your spouse, your brother, your sister, and you both open the refrigerator door together, that would probably be not be a biblical prohibition, but there might be a rabbinic one, depending on the situation. When it comes to refrigerators, we're much more lenient because we want people to be able to eat on Shabbos. But we call this a zeh v'zeh yachol, where two individuals are able to perform a task, yet still they do it together with the assistance of another. We say that that is not considered to be a desecration of Shabbos, because neither one of them is doing the full act, the full task, and because each one could technically have done it on their own. If you have two individuals where one is able to perform the task, like the person in the background, and one is unable to perform I'm sorry, I skipped a step. Where you have two people, neither one of them could do it on their own, like carrying the couch. Neither one of them would have been able to carry the couch on their own. Neither one can do the task without the other. Well, we say that if they were then to carry that couch outside, that would be a biblical prohibition because each one is doing a full act, because it cannot be accomplished on their own. Therefore, each one is considered to have done the full measure that necessary in order to commit the infraction. But then we have the last case here, the case number 3. Zeh yachol v'zeh eino yachol. And that's the case of the picture here, where one's able to carry it and the other one is not able to carry the couch. In this case, we say that the one who is able to perform the task has transgressed by doing it, and the person who is helping but who could not have done it on their own, their action is considered to have no significance. There's a masa ein bo mamish, we say. Since the task would have been done even without him, and now he is here assisting, his actions are considered to have no significance, and as a result, excuse me, there's no problem here whatsoever. So Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach then argues, he believes that the elevator passenger is like the person in the foreground who's not able to move the elevator on his own, while the motor of the elevator is the guy in the back who is able to move the car on his own. Just as in the case of carrying, the person who would have been unable to do it on their own is not considered to have transgressed anything on Shabbos. So too here, while riding in the elevator, this is another reason to be lenient. Rav Shlomo Zalman says, simply being there, even if you're assisting the motor in its operation, you're only an aid to an instrument that could do it on its own. Therefore, it's like the case of the couch, where the person in the foreground is not liable for anything. He's assisting, but he's not accomplishing anything. He could not have done it on his own, and therefore his actions are considered to have no significance whatsoever. That is Rav Shlomo Zalman's argument that riding in an elevator, even if you are assisting the motor, does not constitute a problem. However, Rav Halpern disagrees. Let's take a look and see what he says. He says, due to the passenger's weight in the elevator, the current flow in the motor is reduced to the extent that with the amount of the current flow, it would not be capable of moving the elevator downwards. The elevator then is defined also as an eino yachol, as something that could not have done it on its own. And the passengers are then responsible for the descent of the elevator. This applies whether the passenger weight suffices to move the elevator without the motor's assistance. This would be yachol and eno yachol, where the yachol party, the person who is capable of doing it, is liable, or whether the passenger's weight works in combination with the motor to move the elevator. Neither one of them could do it on their own. These are all cases for which a person would be liable. As a result, Rav Halpern argues that it's not comparable to the case of the couch where you have one party that's capable of doing it on their own and the other person is just merely assisting. That's how Shlomo Zalman argues. Rav Halpern says that no, neither one of these individuals could have done it on their own, neither the motor nor the passenger. And as a result, he says one would be liable for the descent of the elevator in this case.
Missing a part at the very beginning. I don't understand, the elevator could go down even if it's empty.
So that's what you, yeah, that,
Elevators, the way elevators work is they're not like, the motor doesn't pull it up.
Yeah.
There's a counterweight,
I know.
and the elevator, I think if you completely took the brakes off, the elevator go up, not down. So the
The
motor
elevator
actually,
got our building
the
towards
motor
that.
is actually required to push the elevator down, not up. So the more people in the elevator, the less it has to work to push down.
But if no one's in there, an elevator could still go
But
down.
the motor has to work harder. So by you getting in, you make the elevator work less hard. And at that amount, the elevator is working, but the amount that working, if you weren't in there, the elevator wouldn't go down because the counterweight would pull it up.
so therefore the motor nor the passengers are capable on their own to move the elevator down.
Wait, where the motor
Yes.
was on, if it was a passenger.
Oh, I
Right.
gotcha, at the way to go, okay.
Right, exactly. 'Cause- Anywho, that was argument number 3. Let's get to argument number 4.
Let's keep going, Ed.
Yes.
That's really good.
Yeah, we're getting into the weeds. Okay. What's that?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, so that's my mistake. There are 5 discussions. I cut one out because it got you think we're in the weeds here. I had to cull something. But anyway, so this is a what's the term? This is an artifact of the previous version of the class. I had to whittle it down. Okay, now we mentioned that we mentioned Rav Halpern's concern that when an elevator carries a heavy load, the motor turns into a generator and produces electricity that's fed into the power lines. And Rav Halpern writes that constitutes a Torah prohibition, since the generator powers various machines and appliances that perform many malachas. Now you have here, excuse me, a response to this by Professor Zev Lev, who wrote in Tehumim, which is a halachic journal, where he actually argues this point, and he says, yeah, it's generating electricity, but it's actually not being distributed back into the electric system, or at least that's not going into a system where it's actually being used of. You do occasionally find some really rare situations like the World Trade Center where it's somehow getting fed back into the lighting system, but generally speaking, the electricity does not get back into the network. It's not being used for anything. And finally, he also says that this is actually not a biblical prohibition. He calls this a malacha she'eina tzricha legufa, which is that it's not you're not generating electricity, which would be like kindling fire, let's say, for the purpose of using the fire in this case.
Or light.
Or light. Right, exactly. Right. Let's break this down a little bit. In order for me to transgress something on Shabbos, I have to be doing the malacha or the labor for the purpose that is usually associated with that task. So, for example, digging a hole. Why were holes being dug? Well, for one of 2 reasons. Either A, to build foundations for a building. In that case, digging the hole would be a form of construction. Or B, digging a hole is for planting crops. Digging a hole, those are the 2 places in which we find normal definitions of digging in the context of a Shabbos prohibition. What happens if I'm digging a hole for no other purpose other than the fact that I have an oil leak and I want to spread dirt over it or the clay over it so that it absorbs the oil, or I want sand or gravel to throw on some ice? I'm not digging a hole with that intended purpose. And we call that a malacha she'eina tzricha legufa, which is a malacha that, or a labor that's being done, but it's being done for a different purpose than the normally conceived of purpose for that action. That's not a biblical prohibition, that's only a rabbinic one. So he's basically just sort of arguing about the nitty-gritty details. Now, Rav Halpern says, no, it's an Isser D'Oraisa, it's a biblical prohibition that your transgression. He says, at most, it's a rabbinic one. And when it comes to matters of great necessity, we're much more lenient when it comes to rabbinical prohibitions than biblical one.
Otherwise, carrying magnet anywhere where there's electric wire, cause something with that board.
Yeah. Well, again, you're probably getting into that sort of that without intent, without. We're also gonna get. There's another consideration here. I haven't brought it up yet, which is called the dover she'einu miskayim, which is that you have to be, in order for the malacha, in order for the labor to be done, in order for the malacha to be considered a transgression of Shabbos, it has to be a change that is a permanent one or a long-lasting one. If it's just a momentary change, then there's no prohibition here. So, for example, what we talk about, condensation on a window, you write in that condensation. That's not considered writing because that letter that you printed there isn't going to last longer than a few moments. It's either more condensation is going to come, or there's going to there's going to be turnover in the water, or it's all going to evaporate. Anyways, that's not called writing. And in most of these cases over here, that when we're talking about, for example, a brighter light, a dimmer light, changes in the elevator, drawing more current or not drawing more current. These are all temporary, sort of very, very, short changes that cease to be the moment you step off the elevator. In that case, we consider most of these things at the most to be rabbinic, but are not of real serious concern. And we're really dealing about some very specific issues. We're going to get talking about some of the other issues here. We're going to just mention in a moment. Accordingly, so anyway, also Rabbi says that the passengers require and therefore desire that the power be generated by his weight be utilized. For otherwise, the car speed increases without control, and it's possible to slow down and stop except by emergency measures. So he's just saying over here that actually is considered to be for the intended purpose. You want that electricity to be there. And you want it to be used. You see such. Yeah, he's more worried about.
But on the way down, the elevator has actually worked to get you down, so it's not actually.
Okay, listen, I can't argue for every single. Or he's probably dealing with those World Trade Center elevators that are filled to capacity with people, and you're.
The elevator guy taught me that if there's emergency, your elevator go off. He says your bigger issue is smashing the roof. He says the movies are all wrong. So, anyway, sorry.
Anyway, so what are the conclusions? Because we've
There's no Shabbos elevators in Calgary, so you're okay.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. So what are the conclusions? Well, the conclusions are it's very difficult to say yay or nay because there are some valid points that are being made on both sides. So therefore, the halachic consensus is as follows. Therefore, one should make every effort to avoid using a descending automatic elevator. However, one may rely on lenient opinions when it's absolutely necessary. So that means, for example, if you're dealing with somebody who's elderly, somebody who has mobility issues, somebody who's not going to be able to get out of their house unless they're relying on a Shabbos elevator, then it's on that point that we rely on the leniencies. But in general, we try to avoid the problem by not getting into it. So when I was a kid growing up in Toronto at the Bayit, when they constructed the first Shabbos elevator that I had ever seen, and was possibly the first Shabbos elevator in Toronto, we used to ride on it all the time. We used to play it. We used to jump up and down. That ought not to have been doing that. In fact, we were told numerous times that we're not supposed to use it if we don't need it on Shabbos. And this is exactly why. Jumping around, you're definitely affecting how it operates. Mordechai Willig, who's a Rosh Hashiva at Yeshiva University. He's a Rav in New York. He's a very well-respected halachic authority, contemporary halachic authority. He said that one should make every effort to move into an apartment on a low floor to avoid having to rely on the lenient opinions regarding elevators. But however, at the same time, everybody concedes that Rav Halpern does make some very compelling arguments, and his opinion should be followed except in such situations of great need. And again, his opinion was that going up doesn't constitute a problem, it's going down that's actually the bigger issue. Now, what we have not discussed, however, are all the sensors. A complicating factor in this is the presence of electronic weighing mechanisms and the sensors that have, they know, for example, that there are people in it, they know the weight, they can, it changes how the engine operates. It's very computerized, it's not analog in any way, it's completely digital. And these actually do create problems. And Rav Halperin was in his Institute for Science and Halacha would go and modify elevators in order to ensure that all of those systems were turned off, yet at the same time safety parameters were preserved when they would go in and modify an elevator to make it usable for Shabbos. Now, the Tzomet Institute also modifies elevators. When we talk about, for example, electric scooters and all these electronic devices that we use for medical purposes, most of them that we're familiar with come from the Tzomet Institute. They're the big boys on the block when it comes to medical technology on Shabbos and mobility, how to deal with mobility issues. They also will modify an elevator. They will modify it and they will remove some of those systems, with their own programming, again, that preserves safety parameters so that the elevator is not monitoring people constantly and you're not affecting its operation by just simply being present or simply walking on and walking off, right? Everything we've been saying we've been talking about until now is specifically limited to if the elevator is a dumb elevator and is just operating with you inside, but it's not sort of measuring your weight and tracking that how many people have stepped in or stepped out. Someone will modify some of those things, but not to the same extent that Rabbi Halper does. They seem to rely much more on Rabbi Shlomo Zalman's leniencies, and therefore the Tzomid Institute's modifications are a whole lot cheaper, which is why they're the more popular option generally. But we do have to modify the Shabbos elevators, even if it comes from the manufacturer with a Shabbos setting. They're only modifying it so that it stops at every step. Further modification generally has to be done by some of these professionals in order to turn off a lot of those sensors that are now standard as part of the elevator, unless you're purchasing one that actually sort of has been, comes from the manufacturer, like how refrigerators often have a Shabbos mode that takes into consideration many of the halachic issues that the Star K has raised. The Star K has really been on the forefront of Shabbos modes on refrigerators. I'm not sure that elevator companies are as innovative, at least when it comes to halacha, as refrigerators are. Many fewer elevators are being sold to individuals as opposed to refrigerators. You have at least one in every single household. They're much less responsive to their consumer base. One interesting discussion, though, that seems to be pretty universal is that of automatic escalators. Escalators seem to function differently. And the Tzomet Institute, as well as Rav Halperin's Institute, the Institute for Science and Halacha, they seem to say that escalators do not operate in any way similar to a elevator. And as a result, they pose no problem on Shabbos. So there's one area where it seems that one may be lenient to the use of an automatic escalator on Shabbos. These are escalators that are just continuously in motion. In Shmira Shabbos Kehilchasa, this Rabbi Newworth, he permits the use of an automatic escalator on Shabbos because the concerns detailed by Rav Halperin regarding an elevator seem not to apply to escalators. This ruling is of great significance in communities such as that of Hong Kong, where it's very difficult to get from one section of the city to another without the use of escalators. And as a result, we seem to be much more lenient, at least when it comes to this. When it comes to a Shabbos elevator, modifications have to be made, and generally they are made. Even after the modifications have been made, it's still not recommended that a person who doesn't need to use the elevator get on a descending elevator, but there seems to be universal acceptance or allowance of going into an ascending elevator. Shabbos elevator, it doesn't pose any problem. But you still have to be mindful of all the sensors and motion detectors that might be present, and you have to, perhaps do some investigations if you ever encounter one to ensure that it's not monitoring you as you get on and as you get off in order to avoid the pitfalls of
So if it's
Shabbos
not a
concerns.
true Shabbos elevator and someone lives in a high rise and every Shabbos they know Mr. Jones goes up the same floor, not permitted. Do you know what I mean? Like Mrs. Jones, not Jewish.
So I'll tell you what I would say in that case. Generally, we say no, you shouldn't get on the elevator. If you suffer from mobility issues,
Right.
and you know that your next door neighbor is going to go down at a specific time, going, we do rely on Rav Shlomo Zalman's opinion and says yes, you can get on. I would tell you just to be cautious of the motion sensor that detects your footsteps. They have this laser that goes across. Step over it. You can usually see them.
But it's the same exact thing as if the automatic is not.
I don't think
The
Shabbos elevators and getting on with your next door neighbor I don't believe are different. If you know that if the neighbor's going down anyways,
the Shabbos elevator does modifications for the
right. So here in general, I don't think you have to assume that your elevator has all the bells and whistles. I don't think you have to assume that. If you become aware that it does have all the bells and whistles, then perhaps, yeah, you might have it.
Real skyscraper.
Yeah.
But if Mrs. Jones is walking in right beside her,
Like I would venture to say that the elevator at the Glenmore Gardens, for example,
Right.
does not have all the computerized sensors and weight detectors and all these other things. It's probably not as smart an elevator as some of the skyrise buildings. You don't have to assume that. What you do have to be worried about though is the sensor for the door. So you just try to step over it, which is very easy to do. It's down. It's usually pretty low. I would step over it.
or walking at the exact same time as Mrs. Jones.
That is another
Without
option.
looking creepy.
That is another option, right?
Sorry,
Yep. All right, I'm going to turn off the recording, but I am now open to questions, comments, or rebuttals.